watching our non-stop coverage of the G20. The summit begins tomorrow. Heads of state arriving today. And there you can see US President Joe Biden arrived in Delhi just a short while ago. And he is now en route to the Prime Minister's residence, where bilateral talks will be held. And he will be hosted at a private dinner. So Joe Biden there, this was a little dance performance that was there for the president. And then he got into his vehicle, the Beast, that has arrived in Delhi, especially for the president, and is taking him now to Prime Minister Modi's residence. Well, to talk more about the bilaterals, the G20 Summit, and, all that is tied in with this, we're now joined by Pramit Chaudhary, Eurasia Group's practice head for South Asia, Nisha Acharya, CEO of Equal Innovation Consulting, Professor Harsh V. Pant, Vice President Studies and Foreign Policy at Observer Research Foundation. And we'll also joined by Ashok Malik, partner and chair of the India Practice Asia Group, Dr. Tara Kartha, former director, National Security Council Secretary. Thank you so much all for joining us on the program. And Ashok Malik, first to you, there's been such a build-up to the G20. Now the summit to take place tomorrow. US President Joe Biden has just arrived and he's en route for the bilateral talks as well as the dinner. And this is also a very interesting part of the entire G20. The bilaterals that are being held. The Prime Minister has already held 2 earlier today with Mauritius and Bangladesh, now with the US, and in 15 in all will be held on the sidelines of the G20.
There will be a lot of bilaterals on the sidelines of the G20, but the 2 most important ones are the one which begins very shortly with President Joe Biden, and then the visit by the Saudi Crown Prince at the end of the G20 process. This meeting with President Joe Biden is extremely significant because this is actually the 3rd time Prime Minister Modi and President Biden are meeting in a matter of some 3 months. They met in May in Japan for the G7 and the Quad Leaders Summit. Then they met a month later in Washington for the state visit, which was a spectacularly successful state visit covering a gamut of issues. Now they're meeting again here. There's some talk of the Prime Minister probably going back to the US for the APEC summit in November. And then there's talk of President Biden coming back in January or February. Of course, those are unconfirmed. Right. This level of diplomatic engagement at the summit level in India-US history is fairly unprecedented. I'm not even counting the ministerial and NSA level engagement which has happened over the past few months. In 2 or 3 key areas, we are seeing significant advance. One is, of course, as Vishnu mentioned earlier, the defense relationship, the GE jet engines, which are going to be made in India, which are with significant technology transfer, which is important because, quite honestly, more countries can make nuclear weapons than can make jet engines. And this certainly gives India a significant leg up. Then there's the drone, Predator drone purchase from General Atomics pending since 2020. It should finally take place in the coming weeks, maybe even with this visit, we don't know. Then a number of other agreements on critical and emerging technologies as the world becomes more siloed and more allied in terms of technology partnerships. So you're clearly seeing a divergence in the world between a China-led technology ecosystem and a US-India democratic, as it were, ecosystem. And clearly this visit, like the previous visit which Prime Minister Modi had to Washington, will give us significant insights into where that is going. And finally, of course, in a world where geopolitics is influencing business decisions, companies and investors will also look at the proximity of India and the US on the geopolitical stage as a clue and as a motivation to enhance investment in India. It was no surprise that there was a semiconductor investment announced by Micron when Prime Minister Modi was in Washington earlier this year, and maybe there'll be more in the coming months.
That's right, and that we'll have to, wait and see. But definitely, the level of engagement that we are seeing is unprecedented between the US and with India. Pramit Chaudhary, now if we talk about the G20 and one of the challenges that has come up, and as Ashok Malik said, it's a challenging time geopolitically for India, a huge balancing act as well. And you've had a statement by Russia's foreign ministry about India being pressured on the Delhi Declaration, and right now we're not sure whether we will actually have a declaration, or whether there will be, what kind of statement will emerge. We know the US and UK and Europe are very keen to insert the Ukraine war and Russia's invasion in that statement. So a lot of balancing, and those negotiations still taking place, and that statement only will come a day after.
That's correct. I mean, one of the things to keep in mind is that multilateral diplomacy is easily the most difficult form of diplomacy. Bringing in a cluster of countries who are otherwise very sovereign and national in their interests, getting them to agree on a set of issues. Normally, it's, in fact, in many ways, one of the better definitions of being a great power is your ability to persuade countries through carrots, sticks, and so on to come together and do these things. Now, India has done multilateralism before, the non-aligned movement and so on, but those are passive organizations in the sense they didn't actually accomplish anything tangible. The G20 is a serious organization. It represents almost 80% of the global GDP. They're very difficult countries, and a lot of them, we don't necessarily have influence over all of them. And India's put a very extensive agenda. And I think the real heart of this is going to be the climate issues that Modi has put forward, whether it's climate finance, green hydrogen, biofuel alliance, where he's saying that India will help lead countries or persuade these 20, actually 30 countries, other guests have come as well, to try to resolve the biggest global problem we're facing right now, which is the climate crisis. And it's been interesting to watch, especially with the Americans, that in many ways, the Americans have been, among the major economies of the world, the most supportive of India. They've publicly come out and said, we support India's agenda. Internally, they've even fought with the Europeans about multilateral development bank reform and green financing. The Indians are right, you guys are wrong. And have called out China repeatedly, which has been running interference in almost every single one of these points, and said, you guys are trying to break this up, and it's not a good thing. So I think that's another element of the Indo-US relationship which needs to be brought out, is that in the G20, in many ways, America has been extraordinarily supportive of India, and said that where you lead, we will follow in almost every single element.
All right. Professor Pant, a lot is being said about the resolution and the negotiations over that. But even putting that aside, the achievements from this G20 for India, we are hoping one of the big achievements will be the African Union being included in the G20.
Well, indeed, I think I would say that the process itself has been an achievement. So whether or not you get a declaration at the end of it, perhaps has become marginal in the larger scheme of things, although certainly global headlines will run with that there was no joint communique. But I think the process itself has led us to a position where India can articulate a global governance agenda, which is quite distinct from anything we had seen in the past. So I think for India, there is a sense, perhaps there will be a sense of accomplishment that despite the geopolitical tensions, India has been able to revive some sense of optimism about multilateralism, although it's fraying all around. But I think G20 as a process, perhaps by bringing in the voices of the developing world into this process much more effectively than in the past, and framing the entire agenda through that lens, whether you look at the climate agenda, technology, sustainable development, or economic growth and redistribution of economic advantages across the world and within societies. I think all of those are huge questions where the lens, by using the lens of the global south, India has been able to perhaps frame these conversations in a manner that allows for a more productive engagement with these subjects, irrespective of what is happening at the geopolitical level and irrespective of what happens at this particular G20 conference and G20 leader summit. I think going forward, perhaps if this becomes the frame, then I think there is much to win. It's a much big win, not only for India, but I think as India has encapsulated this idea of one world, one family, the sense that wider world requires solutions where important stakeholders are present at every stage. And in this sense, the role of the global south, if you can highlight that, if you can frame your global conversations around that, that perhaps can lead us to a very distinct set of achievements in the future. So I think that has been, throughout the process, a huge accomplishment from a multilateralism perspective, from the perspective of India's global leadership credentials, as well as by bringing in various stakeholders to this conversation.
All right, Dr. Kartha, your views on that. Yes, for India positioning ourselves as, the leader of the global south, a voice of the global south, putting those priorities, on the world stage with US President Joe Biden here for him, given that, Xi Jinping did not come for the G20, an opportunity to project the US as also a dependable partner, both in terms of security and economics.
I mean, on a lighter vein, look at the positivity that comes in when Joe Biden lands. I mean, that there's a kind of, sense that, yeah, he's come. So there is, what the earlier speakers were saying, the relationship between India and the US has gone up so hugely. I mean, I have never seen this kind of a pace in any bilateral relationship for years. I mean, we are going from strength to strength. I think last week you had a meeting of the Indus, the meeting for startups, which was held last week. Then you had an emerging, the technologies meeting. These things are going one after another. There are these meetings taking place on a huge, really, really huge range of issues. In terms of the issues which we are facing on G20, I think you would find that President Biden is far more open to, say climate finance, for instance, or issues which deal with climate than possible future presidents who are talking of talking of things that the climate crisis doesn't exist. So Biden is someone you can do business with, hopefully will continue into the future. But the point is, I think that the messages that we are sending out as of now, in terms of the biofuel alliance, in terms of climate finance, in terms of alternative energy technology, sharing that technology, in terms of forgiving debt, the huge amount of debt. For example, Africa is talking of, I think, $1.3 trillion in debt.
Right.
Those messages are already gone out. I mean, the declaration apart, which one hopes that will come through, and there will be, and I'm sure the US will back us on most things, Ukraine notwithstanding, hopefully. But as far as India is concerned, our positioning on those issues has already gone out. And this entire exercise has been people-centric. I mean, even if you look at digital public infrastructure, you're looking at everything is about getting the results to the people. It's not about sitting in exclusive rooms and, talking about things which nobody understands. This is about things which need to work on the ground. So it's been a very startling, series of ideas from Delhi, which has gone ahead.
Right. Even taking the G20, all the meetings, 200 meetings all over the country has been, a way of democratizing it, making people interested in it. Everybody knows about the G20. Anish Acharya with the US president here. One focus is the bilateral meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Joe Biden. And then, of course, the G20. If you could tell us how this is being viewed there in America.
So I think in general, the growing partnership between the U.S. and India is viewed very positively by most Americans. I think there's a large Indian American community, and so they are influential politically, both in India as well as in the United States. And that has, for the last 30 years, been drawing the two countries together. As Vishnu was saying earlier, 15 years ago, there wasn't as much person-to-person relationship. I think the growth of the community has changed that. I think here, I'm actually here for an event with the Startup 20 committee of G20 called Impact G20X. And what we're seeing is that the leadership of India on the G20 committees is actually having an effect in terms of engaging all sorts of actors, companies, startups, foundations, others to come to the G20 and look at it as a vehicle to get big things done. So I think I would say the U.S. India bilateral key issues such as artificial intelligence, supply chain, climate change, defense, all of those are manifesting itself not just in the meeting between Biden and Modi, but we're seeing it across the G20. So the bilateral agenda becomes the global agenda, and I think that's very exciting.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us on the program, and we will continue speaking to you over the next few days as India is hosting the G20, and tomorrow the summit begins. Over the weekend, short while ago, US President Joe Biden arrived in Delhi, and he will be holding talks with the Prime Minister shortly, and the Prime Minister is also hosting him for dinner. We'll slip into a short break and return with more. Stay with us.